So now I'm just going to switch gears a bit and share some thoughts on the readings this week and give a short discussion on modern and postmodernist theories of knowledge making, also referred to as structuralism and post-structuralism. So this week we're focusing mainly on the first half of chapter 2, and I want us to really spend time on this first half of the chapter because it's filled with a lot of content, and I really want to sink into some of these concepts with you. And then next week we'll discuss in more detail the Foucauldian aspects of this chapter, Foucault's theories, about discourse, power, and subjectivity. So, and how these ideas work in early childhood spaces, and in particular in relation to discourses of quality. But this week we'll be paying attention more to modernism and postmodernism. So to get us started in thinking about these orientations to knowledge making, I want us to have a short discussion about what is a paradigm. So a paradigm is a set of beliefs that frame a dominant assumption, a way of seeing and knowing something, and these beliefs and ways of knowing are informed by socio-cultural and political contexts or milieu. And these assumptions often become familiar and normalized as a truth. And these truths then inform social and public life, our ways of being, the performance of our identities, the values of society, our ideas about what counts as knowledge, what counts as important and valued, and with that, the ways in which institutions structure themselves. So Thomas Kuhn was a physicist and philosopher of science who, in his book in the 1960s called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, proposed the notion of a paradigm shift, whereby dominant norms which frame assumptions about a particular truth begin to shift and change, and new paradigms of thought emerge which offer new ways of understanding and knowing the world. Yet these shifts are in no way quickly moving. They come into action often in slow and subtle ways. So the paradigm in which we're situated informs what we're able to see and our capacities for understanding the world. So often that which falls outside of such a paradigm becomes invisible in some ways. That which falls outside of a regime of truth may not fit within the structures of thought that inform what we see and what counts. So these categories of thought inform how we interpret and make sense of the world. So the social, cultural, economic, and political milieu in which we live and these orientations to knowledge shape the emergence of theory, the perspectives and orientations that allow us to make sense of the world in particular ways. So in this sense, the social project of education and the theories which inform it are very much in conversation with current times. So the purpose of education, what we think education is for, is in deep relation with the values of society and the theories that uphold and support these values. So with regard to paradigms, as Kuhn proposed, perhaps they aren't so linear or chronological as Kuhn argued. Historically, there are many theories of education that have emerged in response to socio and political milieu of the times. And as these times and contexts change, the theories which inform knowledge making also change as they're situated in different socio-cultural dynamics. So in many ways, these histories of thought and the legacies of past theories are very much alive in education today. And there are reasons why particular beliefs remain ingrained in the structures of schooling and the subjectivities that are created within these conditions. So in this course, we'll be aiming to make visible how these theories live in early childhood education, tracing where they come from and what they do. What kinds of subjectivities do they produce? And because these theories are informed by social and political milieu, we'll also be making visible how these theories are non-neutral, that they're non-innocent, and that they're filled with colonial tensions. So thinking about how they position the human in the construction of knowledge, the construction of the child and childhood, and the image of the educator, and how all of these concepts are informed by social values. So these theories are not vacant of political intention. So throughout this course, I invite you to consider education as a political project, and we'll be going further into detail in that in the next few weeks. So in chapter 1, Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence point to how the notion of quality, though often viewed as given in early childhood education, is actually a constructed concept, an idea that is deeply informed by a dominant social discourse and reliance on objective scientific truths to measure and maintain status quo, as you've read in this week's chapter. So in this book, the authors are not arguing that quality is something that ought to be sought after or achieved, but rather they're arguing that quality is something that needs to be questioned. They argue that quality, control, and measurement in early childhood education perpetuates a standardized, generalized, and transcendental baseline for education and for children's development, and of childhood that perhaps ignores the complexity and multiplicity of children and families and their life experiences across numerous social cultural locations. So in this way, the project of quality is very much informed by knowledge-making processes that originated during the Enlightenment period, a time where thinkers were engaging in intellectual efforts that were based in objectivity, reason, morality, and the idea that there was an absolute truth that science could discover. So this orientation to knowledge created a separation of the researcher from the world in which he, at that time, studied, and a universal assumption of the truth of things that was based in classification and categorical thought. So modernity is very much informed by these ideals. So during the industrial era, these rationalities were intensified in many ways as they supported an economic boom in the industrial area, where these ways of knowing were intimately in the service of the nation state and their goals via progress and economic expansion. So linear accumulation and growth, and a separation or emancipation of reason and the human from social, cultural, ecological, and political life. Objectivity served to separate human experience, cultural context, from knowledge-making processes and the production of truths. So under the guise of objectivity and reason, modernity supposed that human reason and the scientific method enabled a separation from culture, context, history, and milieu. So in the pursuit of a universal absolute truth that could be proven and thus obliged to. So developmental psychology is one field that's very much alive in early childhood education today, that in many ways is still informed by these logics. Developmental psychology is very much an ally in the project of quality in early childhood education, and it creates an image of the individual, autonomous, measurable child. It creates a baseline of what childhood ought to be. So in this course, we'll be questioning what these mechanisms of quality and the theories that inform them do. Who benefits from them? What are they in the service of? What are the effects? And what do they do to subjectivities and how we are? And you can read more about this on page 14 of your text. So if we trace where quality comes from, that it's informed by a particular theoretical vantage point, we can see that quality is a non-neutral concept, that quality is informed by a particular paradigm, by a way of viewing the world that may not be as universal as it's claimed to be. Perhaps we might notice how quality might actually be considered violent, how it perpetuates a neo-colonial desire for governmentality, standardization, and efficiency that excludes and oppresses those who fall outside of its terms, that its logics emerge from a particular place and time in the world that is in the service of particular world-making practices. Though modernity seeks to neutralize its intentions under the mask of objectivity, it's becoming increasingly argued, especially now in the 21st century, and actually beginning in the 80s, but more recognized now, that knowledge is actually constructed. All theory comes from somewhere and holds with it some intention, that knowledge is not something that exists out there waiting to be discovered, but that it's actively made and remade in relation with those who think it into being. And in your readings last week, you read a quote by Patty Lather on page 8 that speaks to the times in which we live. She writes, "We're at a fundamental turning point in social thought, an epochal shift marked by thinking differently about how we think. We seem to be somewhere in the midst of a shift away from the concept of a found world out there, objective, knowable, factual, toward a concept of constructed worlds." And she wrote that in 1991. So these ideas definitely aren't new, but I think that this post-structural, postmodernist, or reconceptualist way of thinking about thinking is now starting to gain more traction on the ground pedagogically. And that's something that we'll also be discussing in this course, is what is it about these theories that matter to early childhood education? What does this look like on the ground? What does this do? So this idea that knowledge is constructed is the basis of postmodern or post-structural thought, which we'll be thinking closely with in this course. And this is the orientation of the authors of this book. That the absolute universal truths that uphold modern thought are not enough to respond to the complexities of the worlds in which we live. Postmodern theory is an umbrella term with many theoretical perspectives that operate within it. Feminist theory, social constructionist theory, deconstructionism, critical race theory, post-human philosophy are a few to name within this umbrella of post-structural theory or postmodern theory. And these theories posit that the human subject is not an isolated individual knowable through measurement or observation, but rather the subject is in an internal state of flux and reformation in relation with multiple others. The subject in postmodern theory is contingent, multiple, heterogeneous, and constructed with the moving world, and thus ways of knowing are multiple in nature, that there is no one absolute truth, but multiple perspectives. On page 24, Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence borrow from the philosopher Heraclitus in saying, "You never jump into the same water twice." Thus, our ways of understanding and gathering meaning can never be universal or static. The world is always moving and thus vulnerable to a sense of unknowability, uncertainty, and difference. And this is a fundamental theme in postmodern theory. And you'll be focusing on that specific quote this week in your provocation forums. So one thing I think that's central to take away from this week is not only the meanings and the understandings that support modern and postmodern thought, but the idea that these two perspectives don't exist within a binary. So if we're thinking with postmodern theory, it doesn't mean that we're abandoning science or scientific thought, or that we're in some sort of confrontation with modernism. As it's written in the text, postmodernists take science very seriously, and the sciences are central in many facets of life. But what we're proposing is that perhaps there's not only one way of seeing the world, that there are problems that emerge when only one way of knowing the world is valued as legitimate and reputable, and that it has social effects. Here we're troubling the binary of this or that kind of knowledge, right or wrong, modern or postmodern, old or new. These terms are not so separate. So in this course, we'll be skeptical to this kind of categorical thought, And we're going to be problematizing the grand narratives that transcend circumstance and paying attention to how these narratives serve particular peoples in particular contexts, and that they create racialized, gendered, and classed hierarchies in the world. So we're trying to think in ways that allow for more nuanced complexity, dissensus, and multiplicity of thought. So that's why at the beginning of the first video, I encouraged you to try to stay with the trouble of a question rather than jumping to solutions. Because if we stay with a question, we're able to figure something out with more complexity, to suspend ourselves in making assumptions. So for your week 2 provocation, you'll be writing a 200 or 300 word response to this question. What are the core themes of postmodern theory, and how does the phrase by Heraclitus that says, the second time that you jump in the water, you don't jump into the same water? So you'll be responding to that phrase and thinking about how the core themes of postmodern theory are exemplified in that phrase. So it'll be 200 or 300 words, APA style, and again, as I said earlier, be very careful and conscious about the language that you're choosing to use. Be intentional about your writing. It needs to be concise and very clearly written. Again, this is 10% of your grade, so make sure that you're doing your best work. And yeah, so I think that's it for now, everybody. Again, if you have any questions or concerns about the assignments or the course content, please do feel free to email me. I'm happy to set up a Skype conversation with you at any point this term. And yeah, looking forward to engaging in the forums with you all this term. Thanks.